everybody had their things to help them get through COVID. You know, Animal Crossing, Kraken, Bean Dad. But for me and for my wife, Kelly, it's been me introducing her to the franchise of Star Trek. She had never watched it before, but it was a huge part of my upbringing. And as we watched it together, I think we both learned that it was something that we really, really needed this year. It was what I really needed to get through the worst of this virus and what it showed about humanity. She was a little hesitant because I think Star Trek has a bit of an unfair reputation, one that I don't think is earned. And I do think that it's a franchise that has a lot to offer people. So if you haven't watched Star Trek before, or you tried once and bounced off of it, this video is going to be about me telling you why you should give it a chance, why it's important to me, and then, if you're curious, I'll give you a little rundown on which shows you should start with. Hi, I'm very lazy, and this is Tristan Won't Shut Up. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification because otherwise I shrink and die. So for the completely uninitiated, Star Trek is a science fiction franchise, primarily TV shows, that started in the mid-1960s by the late Gene Roddenberry. The current moment, it has 9 TV shows, 13 movies, and an endless cavalcade of books, RPGs, merchandise, you name it. It's almost kind of cliche to try and introduce something as monumental as Star Trek. You've almost absorbed a lot of things about it just through cultural osmosis. It's been so profoundly impactful on Western culture in the 20th and 21st centuries. And for a lot of people, I think the thing that they bounce off of is this idea that Star Trek is kind of a thing for dads. You know, it's either peak nerd shit, so you got to keep away from it, or it's like dad stuff. And I mean, like, my dad was my introduction to Star Trek when I was a kid, but still. The shows, especially the older shows, reek of, you know, mid-century boomer space age nostalgia. It was also from a time where we were way more optimistic about space and technology. I could also understand why people would think it's dad stuff, because a lot of people, their first introduction to it is like the first 6 Star Trek movies, which are very much about middle-aged men trying to face the fact that they're not as young as they used to be. Which, you know, is a thing dads think about. And we all know that Star Trek is nerd shit. It's got aliens, it's got spaceships, it's got unironic use of ray guns. It is what it is. But you know, we live in an age where nerd shit's not as ostracized as it used to be. The fact that millennials are getting into Dungeons and Dragons, which is another silly, retro, nerdy thing, makes me think that there might be an in for this franchise. And it has weird conservative fans like Ted Cruz who are getting something out of this series that I have no idea what it is. And without, like, a lot of experience, you might think that it's just Captain Kirk beating up lizard people or firing photon torpedoes, you know, just like a show, like a less good version of Star Wars where it's just, you know, punching people and firing weapons and, you know, action movie in space. But I'll tell you that for all of its alien weirdness, Star Trek is not that. It is a meditation on what is the nature of humanity, and really deals a lot with, like, what is the human spirit? And the answer to it, now, and while Star Trek has had various creators and many, many writers over the years, the fundamental answer to, like, the question, the philosophical question, what is the human spirit, is that humans are inherently good. And it portrays a future in which humans rise to the occasion and embrace the better angels of our nature. And often the themes of Star Trek are about radical empathy, openness to talking as a way to avoid violence, and an embrace of other cultures, knowing that we all have something that we can learn from each other. And there are times when the show forgets that, but when it's at its best is when it's speaking out against violence and how the act of violence is something that is innately bad and corrupts the people who do it. And for every time that Star Trek has aired, except for maybe in the early 2000s, it's extremely progressive. And then on top of all that, you also get a lot of really cool high concept science fiction, which is, you know, something that I live for personally. I had to fight an urge to just list a whole bunch of episodes that I want you to watch. Oh yeah, and Star Trek is socialist as fuck.
Workers of the world, unite.
While it does keep the economics of the Star Trek world vague, it does very heavily say, though, that all life has value, and it's not based on whether or not you can make somebody rich money. And while they do keep the economics vague, they do say that there's no money in the Star Trek future, and that people work to better themselves and humanity.
You see, money doesn't exist in the 24th century.
No money? You mean you don't get paid?
The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
And there's something like super revelatory about that. There's almost like a capitalist realism in all sorts of fiction, and science fiction doesn't escape that. Star Trek is actually like the only science fiction that I can think of off the top of my head where they address the idea of like the tyranny of money and how in a world without money, it would be just so liberating. In our sort of capitalist realism world, it's kind of hard to imagine what life would be like if there wasn't money. And so I'm always really happy that Star Trek, gave me an idea of what that would be like as a child, so that I, would have these sort of utopian ideals as something to strive towards as a, left-wing activist today. And it also just has great goofy shit.
Sir, I protest. I am not a merry man.
Even when it's bad, there's always something funny happening. Sometimes there are entire episodes that are designed to be comedy episodes, and they legit slap sometimes. So I want to introduce this franchise to my wife, Kelly. She did not grow up with a lot of nerdy stuff in her childhood. About a year ago, I gave her a taste of the series, and now we are watching through the whole franchise. I have to say, it has been an amazing journey to see this series, something that's been, very close to my heart through her perspective. I talked to her a little bit about what she likes about it, and her favorite things are that it loves its characters, that it very often brings up interesting ideas. And that it is fundamentally based on love and cooperation and avoiding violence. So maybe I've sold you, and you're looking at, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of TV shows, a whole bunch of movies, and thinking, oh crap, where do I even start? And so I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of the TV shows, because the TV shows are the main event when it comes to Star Trek. And so I'm just going to go through the series that have come out or are coming out so far, and I'll let you decide which ones that fit what you'd be interested in. So let's start with the original series.
Space, a final frontier.
It's very 1960s. It's very campy. If you can handle that, if you can handle campy, if you can handle a 1960s TV show with the way that shows were made back then, with the casual sexism of its time, and are okay with cheap sets and goofy costumes and those kinds of things, it is a very fun experience. There are some gems in that collection of things. Like, this TV show didn't start a whole franchise for nothing. If you're a completionist, this is where you should start. But if you're not, there's a few really, really good episodes, but for the most part, you're gonna have a hard time getting through a bulk of this TV show. And if somehow you couldn't get enough of the original series, there was also a short-run animated series that is still campy, has some questionable voice acting, and even more questionable animation. But I can't really speak about Star Trek the Animated Series because I actually haven't seen a whole lot of it. The show that most people will probably point to, and probably the one I'd recommend most people start with, is Star Trek The Next Generation, which premiered in 1987, and more hits a lot of what I love about the franchise. Many people consider The Next Generation or TNG their favorite. It is, of all the things I talked about Star Trek, it is the peak of all of those. It still has some weird episodes and it takes a few seasons to really find its feet. There's a whole saying in the Star Trek community that when Commander Riker grows a beard, that's when the show really starts to take off. But it's got weirdness because it was the 1980s and 1990s, and TV shows had these absolutely insane production schedules. So you're gonna have a few weird episodes in the bunch.
I demand to see the captain.
Stop! Return to your quarters!
The next one is my personal favorite, which is Deep Space Nine, which is, the favorite of a strong minority of Star Trek fans. Unlike the other shows, it's not based on a ship, it's based on a space station. And so because of that, it has a lot more character development and a lot more serialized storytelling. This has a lot more to do with like space politics and religion, and there's a war. And during this war, the ideals, the humanity rising to a better angel of its nature, is tested to its limit. It also has a lot of time to play around with the non-Starfleet side of the Star Trek universe. You get to see what non-human cultures are like a lot more. And it deals with like serious political themes. The main conflict is about a planet that was essentially occupied for 80 years by an interstellar empire that has just been liberated. And so like the people who are rising to the top spent their youths as like actual terrorists. The best character, Kira Nerys, was a former terrorist who now has to become essentially a powerful, high-profile leader of her people. The next show that came up was Star Trek Voyager, which is based on a ship, but it's not based on like a big flagship like the Enterprise, which a lot of the other shows are based on. So what it's about this smaller ship that through some weirdness that happens in the first episode gets launched to the other side of the galaxy, and it's going to take it about 75 years, unless something changes, to get home. So they're completely lost, there's no Federation, and they're trying to find a way to keep their ideals and keep the ship going and find a way back. It's a very interesting premise, and the show has a lot of very likable characters. That being said, the show was heavily disliked by Star Trek fans when it came out, but it is having a sort of renaissance as it's come on Netflix. And so it's starting to turn into a show that some Trek fans think was unfairly maligned back in the 90s by sort of like an older generation of Star Trek fans, and that younger people are actually finding it quite good. I'm revisiting this show soon, and I'll report more on how this rewatch goes. I'm actually pretty excited for it. I'll also mention that if this video does all right, then I actually might make a video on each of these series as we go, because I want to talk about what I really liked about them. The next one we need to talk about is Enterprise, which...
Optimism, Captain!
has a particular flavor. It wouldn't be my recommendation for anyone's first Star Trek. If you're watching the series chronologically, this is the first one. As opposed to the other shows, this one actually takes place in the 22nd century, where everything takes place like at the earliest, the 23rd century. So it's kind of written as like a prequel series and a bridge between our world and the utopian future of the Star Trek world. So instead of like hyper-competent people who know everything, it's about humanity's first steps out into the cosmos, where we don't really know what we're doing, and we're dealing with forces that are quite beyond our ability to deal anything with. I'll also note that I rewatched this recently, and this show did not handle 9/11 very well. Enterprise is probably Star Trek at its most conservative. When 9/11 happened, it influenced the third season of the show. And trust me, if you watch the show, you'll know what I'm talking about. And everything about it is just like war on terror, like we need to be compromising all of the ideals that make Star Trek great in order to defeat the existential threat. And I thought that that was just awful. But if you are, like me, interested in that kind of early 2000s period of our cultural history, to really see what it was like when like the early war on terror made a lot of people lose their minds, this show is pretty good for that. And it almost spends all of season 4 apologizing for the things that they condoned in season 3. So it's better than its reputation implies, but yeah, it's still got some episodes where you have to be like, wow, this is like Star Trek written by a reactionary. It also contains an episode that is one of the most Islamophobic things I've ever seen. And if I ever decide to get into the writing a video essay about episodes of TV shows and movies, which is, a much more popular gig to get into, I might do a piece on that episode of Enterprise. Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise all represent an era of Star Trek. It began in sort of the later years of Gene Roddenberry's life, and he died in the early 90s. And so the later seasons of The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager and Enterprise represent like an era where Rick Berman and that group of people are essentially running the show. After Enterprise was canceled, it sort of fell out of their hands, and the franchise listed for about a decade. The first thing to come out after Star Trek was canceled in 2005 was the 2009 J.J. Abrams movie, which, is its own thing. But it didn't come back to television until 2017 with the next show I'm going to talk about, Star Trek Discovery. And, some of those real Trek fans really have it in for Star Trek Discovery, but it is a great show, and I will fight people on that one. It had a bit of a rocky start, like all shows do, but even then, it was doing all right. It just had a lot of issues because there was a lot of drama going on behind the scenes in the first couple seasons. But with season 3 ending the week that I'm recording this, every season does tell a cohesive story that's pretty cool. And one of the things that, I was a little bit worried about when Star Trek Discovery was announced, the balance between Star Trek's more episodic nature and modern television's stronger desire for bingeable, serialized content was really well balanced with Discovery. And I think that Discovery did a very good job at taking this franchise that was sort of, in mothballs for over a decade, that was very much based on television as its norms were 20 years ago, and brought it to our modern age of prestige TV, and did a really good job at striking a good balance, that it feels like Star Trek, but it's also, doing something new with the platform. Also, one common criticism of Star Trek throughout the franchise's past is that it never really did a great job at talking about LGBTQ+ issues and didn't really have a whole lot of queer characters. In fact, it had none. Discovery corrects that with a huge rebound. Season 3 featured the first non-binary and first trans character, and from season 1, the main cast includes a married gay couple. Then we've got Picard, which sort of acts as a spiritual sequel to Star Trek The Next Generation and the movie Star Trek Nemesis. And so I really wouldn't recommend watching it unless you have watched TNG and you've watched Nemesis, because it is entirely TNG nostalgia. And if you don't have that nostalgic attachment to Captain Picard and everything like that, the show probably won't hit you as hard as it hit me. And I would say it's a fun show. It's serialized. It uses a familiar character to explore some interesting corners of the universe, and it advances the timeline of the Star Trek universe, so we get to see what happened after the last movie chronologically in the universe, which was in 2002. And the other one, which honestly might be the best, new person introduction to Star Trek, just aired this year, which is a show called Star Trek Lower Decks. And I love a lot that's happening with it. They took one of the writers of Rick and Morty and gave him a Star Trek show. And this animated series focuses less on the senior officers of a spaceship, and it focuses on the low-ranked, workers on the ship. It's animated, half-hour comedy. It is, format-wise, the furthest thing from your typical Star Trek fare, but its sense of humor, its love for the material, and just new take on a familiar franchise was really fun. And if you're somebody who might not want to commit to 7 seasons of 44-minute dramas, Lower Decks might be a good way to get your feet wet. So, all that being said, 2020 fucking sucked. I know that's not exactly the most novel thing to say these days, but 2020 was a year where we saw some of the worst of humanity on display. You know, we've seen our leaders lead now millions into pointless deaths because of their slavish devotion to capitalism. We've seen racist violence, rampant misinformation and conspiracy theories, and people who've made it their political identity to be selfish. You know, we just seen people thinking so small and really just the ugliest side of what our species is like. And so when I said that I've been watching Star Trek, I think that it really helped with like my hope in our species. And I've been hearing from a lot of other people that Star Trek is the thing that they have been watching to get through 2020 as well. And so I don't think I'm alone in turning to Star Trek as almost a pillar of comfort in a time when my faith in humanity is really under scrutiny. Star Trek has always been a comfort blanket in tough times for me, and I'm very happy to see it happening again, and this time I get to share it with somebody. And you know, when I'm involved in a political movement, which at the moment is kind of low on hope, it's really good to have something that shows a better future is possible and there is something to strive towards. It's good to imagine a better world for everybody. So that is why you should watch Star Trek.